Good afternoon, Chicago. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and this is Reset. We made it to the end of the week, so let's take a look back at the local news that you need to know, but you might have missed. It's time for our weekly news recap.
We will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
Across the city of Chicago and countless homes, people are concerned.
The flyer that we're giving out, it has phone numbers for the consulate, the Mexican consulate, the Honduran consulate, the Guatemalan consulate.
With or without the Trump administration, my role is to protect the people of Illinois.
We are coordinating with all of our sister agencies and our city departments, including our police department, that we are not going to do the work of the federal government.
Here to take us behind the week's headlines is Simone, Alicea, executive producer of CityCast Chicago. That's the daily podcast and newsletter. Hey, Simone.
Hey, Sasha.
Rick Pearson is here, chief political reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Great to have you back on the recap.
Always good to be here.
And rounding out our panel today is Dan Mihalopoulos, WBEZ investigative reporter on our government and politics team. What, twice in 1 week, Dan?
Twice in 1 week.
On the show?
On the show?
Yeah. I know. What is time? What is time anymore? Well, good to see you. So as the pageantry of the inauguration was going on Monday, Chicago also found itself in the national spotlight because this was over threatened immigration raids. What were some of the rumors that were swirling about last weekend, Simone?
Yeah, right before the inauguration, we saw these stories come out in the New York Times, the Washington Post, that said that raids were happening. There was an operation. I think it was Operation Safeguard, and that there were going to be immigration agents out on the streets, and specifically out on the streets of Chicago, and that they were going to be doing raids, trying to deport some 2,000 people. And this wasn't totally surprising. We'd heard stuff like this before, right? The Trump administration had already kind of come out and said, even before Trump was inaugurated, that Chicago is going to be ground zero for deportations.
That's right.
This is where we're going to start, sanctuary cities, et cetera, et cetera. But this was something that was sort of, we had some specific information, it seemed. Now, the Trump's so-called border czar,
Tom
Homan, he sort of tried to walk that back on Saturday evening and was like, well, this was a leak and we don't really know where we're going to go yet. And we're not sure. But at that point, the news was already out and it was causing frankly, a lot of fear, a lot of panic among Chicago's immigrant communities. And you had a lot of people out over the weekend doing Know Your Rights workshops. You had, everyone you had officials coming out and reaffirming the welcoming city status of Chicago, and Pritzker also as well coming out talking about Illinois, how law enforcement officials, will not collaborate with ICE. But, the effect was the same. It still had a chilling effect. And you saw headlines from Sunday, Monday, Tuesday about how, 26th Street in Little Village, how that was a ghost town, quote unquote, workplaces where people didn't show up because they were afraid that raids were coming.
Yeah. I'm assuming you heard some of these reports on raids, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's happened in other cities already. Well, first, the first story was that on the day after the inauguration, that, there would be mass raids focusing first on Chicago. Then there was some talk, some reports that, well, because that leaked out, that wasn't going to be the case. Obviously, it did not turn out to be the case. But let's be clear. I mean, there have been raids through Democratic and Republican administrations for years and decades, obviously. The question is, are we going to have this quote-unquote mass deportation? How much will it focus on people who have, for instance, deportation orders because they've committed a crime, whether it be minor or more serious? And then the issues like in Newark, I think the mayor said there was one raid where they actually picked up other people who weren't undocumented, people who were even citizens, a veteran of the military. So I think when you talk about people staying home and hiding out from workplaces, schools, it's not just Little Village. Obviously, at this point, Mexican community in the Chicago area, which is probably roughly 1 million people out of 7 million. I couldn't give an exact number, obviously, on how many of them and other immigrants from other countries are undocumented. There are some estimates based on various things, but at the end of the day, they're all over our country, all over our city. They're deeply ingrained in our economy. in restaurants, in farm fields, in factories, landscaping crews, cleaning crews, in buildings where major corporations are having their offices. So, that's part of our economy where we have not. You talk about H-1B programs. There hasn't been a program on the other end of the economic spectrum for the menial or manual labor that is part of the economy to be imported because there aren't enough people here.
So, of course, in response, Mayor Johnson says Chicago will not cooperate with federal immigration officers. Shortly after President Trump's inaugural address on Monday, he joined me here on Reset. Johnson did.
We simply are saying to the people of Chicago, if you are an immigrant or a migrant, you're not alone. That a threat to an immigrant or a migrant is just as much of a threat to a black family on the west side of Chicago who wants education to be guaranteed, or Asian families who have experienced, anti-Asian sentiment as well as anti-Asian attacks.
Yeah.
That an attack to one group is an attack against all of us.
Rick, tell us how else the mayors responded to Trump's deportation threats.
Well, it's pretty clear about how federal law applies to sanctuary states and cities. And it's one of the biggest differences is that a lot of ICE's deportation activities involve the use of administrative warrants. They're not issued by a judge. They don't have to meet the higher standard of a court-issued warrant. And the state is saying you disregard those, basically. And so is the city. But trying to communicate that kind of a difference to people on the ground is a very difficult thing. But I mean, there is a kind of, there has been that movement of know your rights. Here's phone numbers for legal assistance, all of that. And there are some very basic fundamentals here that appear to be ICE creating problems trying to cause conflict with state authorities. I mean, we've already seen DOJ, for example, talking about going after public officials who, quote, get in the way of ICE activities. Well,
do we have a good understanding of what that means, though?
No, we don't know what that means. And frankly, it just sounds like a lot of bullying, a bullying attempt. But, I mean, again, the law is clear on where there's separation on deportation. Enforcement activity is a federal responsibility, and the courts have held that the state does not have to play any role in that at all.
Right. Now, if our listeners want to hear more about how these threats of prosecution could impact local officials, Monday on Reset, we will be talking to a former federal prosecutor. So tune in at noon on Monday for more on that issue that Rick just mentioned. So, Rick...
I mean, to me, it's just more of kind of this immediacy of inauguration, executive order, day one, whatever, rhetoric. But when the rubber meets the road here, the feds do not have any traction here.
As we know, Johnson spoke at the U.S. Conference of Mayors last weekend, and so he and other big city mayors are preparing for this Trump administration. How is the president responding, though, to pushback from leaders of sanctuary cities like Chicago?
Well, but it's again, this has been Donald Trump from the very get-go. I mean, we all know the different names that he's referred to Chicago by. There's no doubt that Tom Homan singled out Chicago as an example of a
when
place
he was here in December.
Yeah, that he, there is no doubt that this is playing on his mind. But the fact of the matter is, will there be some raids here? I'm sure there will be. But to what extent? Do they go after public facilities where you have the idea of like schools or shelters where you do have the fact of interaction between public officials and ICE that will occur there? Or will they go for, I would say, more low-hanging fruit type things of going after employers who aren't necessarily as well versed in the law and conduct raids there where even though efforts have been made by various aspects in the business community, restaurant association, manufacturers association, all these places to know your rights, have your documentation for your workers. I think I could see a private sector enforcement attempt here just because I think that might be something where they would meet less resistance.
Yeah. The city council also weighed in on the immigration issue, Simone. Last week, they voted down attempts to weaken immigrant protections. What are we hearing from alders?
I think from alders we're hearing, much of the same, particularly from, the alders who voted down that effort that you talked about, which that effort essentially would have opened up, law enforcement agents, Chicago police, to work with federal immigration authorities in the case of people who have criminal records, and actually people who are even under arrest, who have been charged but not convicted of crimes. Again, that effort failed, and the alders who voted that down have sort of come out to say, align with the mayor in the sense of like, we don't plan to work with ICE, right? The city of Chicago does not plan to work with ICE. And one thing I thought was really interesting was this effort to put up the Know Your Rights sort of bullet points out on the CTA.
Really?
This came out, the mayor's office sent this press release that was like, we're going to be putting these up on screens along the CTA. I haven't had the chance to see them in person, but that to me is really, really interesting. And I think actually marks sort of the first time that I have seen a really public facing kind of campaign on this, that it kind of goes beyond rhetoric and saying, this is what we're telling police, this is what we're telling city workers. It's something that is, hey, we're out here doing this. And I thought that was really interesting.
Just to show you what kind of is going on, at the same time, on the opposite side, we just posted a story about a downstate Republican state senator who worked in Department of Corrections for 20 years. She put out on Twitter that because it would be violating policy for you to cooperate with ICE about immigrants that are in the prison system, tell me, and I will tell ICE. Basically,
because
to circumvent.
the state law prevents law enforcement, but doesn't talk about other
state senators,
officials or anyone else employed by the state.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and we are breaking down the biggest stories of the week with a panel of first-rate journalists. We've got Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago, WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos, and Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune. I want to revisit something that you brought up earlier, Simone. While Donald Trump was being sworn in on Monday, Governor Pritzker was touring Chicago's largely Mexican communities of Pearson and Little Village. Let's listen to a little bit of what he had to say the next day.
These are people who have raised families in the United States, who are law-abiding, and often are the anchors of their communities. And I think we should think very carefully about what immigration means to this country. It is what we were founded upon. It is something that we should have comprehensive immigration reform in this country, and not simply have a president who is scaring people.
So the governor says deportation threats are having an economic impact and that businesses in Pearson and Little Village are suffering. He says they're empty because immigrants, legal and undocumented, they're just afraid to be there. Is that what you're hearing too, Simone?
I think that's what all the reporting has said, and from folks at the Tribune and in BEZ and as well. Anyone who's out in these neighborhoods and talking to street vendors, talking to people who are out in Home Depot parking lots, in addition to factory workers, restaurant workers. There is across these industries where you see a lot of these, as Dan said, sort of lower wage immigrant workers. They are seeing they're seeing less attendance. Fewer people just aren't showing up. People are not out on the streets selling the tamales.
So
and it's not just in Little Village or
exactly.
It's because, as Dan mentioned, about how incorporated into the fabric of our lives are these people,
right?
That it's also in restaurants in River North that people are not showing.
Or the bungalow belt in the suburbs and in the rural areas of this country too. I think there's a conflict there because one of the things that this president was elected on back in November was lowering the price of eggs and the price of everything that went up under Biden. But I think his first goal also was cracking down on undocumented immigration, which you would call illegal, and as well as people who are actually documented, like asylum seekers from Venezuela and other countries. But that's in conflict with that goal of lowering prices in a significant way, because there are so many industries that are reliant upon sort of lower skill labor that is imported.
But that was that victimization and fear campaign that ultimately proved successful. I mean, the issue of undocumented and crime, which there are statistics that show there is no real relationship to that. But it's keep driving the message, keep driving the message.
And fear. Now, give us an overview, Rick, of Pritzker's response to not just these deportation warnings, but the president's attempt to end birthright citizenship.
Well, I mean, and as we already know, that a court, it was, I believe, a Reagan-appointed judge who said, like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've seen in front of me since I've been on the bench, and said it's absolutely unconstitutional to try by executive order to reverse a constitutional standard.
Yeah.
And so, as Pritzker has been saying, this is part of, I think, he's using this word a lot in these early days of Trump, this is the chaos. This is the chaos that we said was going to happen if he returns, and we're going to be caught in this chaos. The issue of no communication between Homeland Security, City of Chicago, State of Illinois, is part of that, quote, chaos that's going on as well.
So I also just want to clarify, President Trump has said the U.S. is the only country in the world that offers birthright citizenship, but that is not true. Dozens of other countries like Canada, Mexico, and many South American nations offer birthright citizenship.
I didn't know what the law was in the 51st state of Canada, in your homeland.
And neither does
land.
your new president.
But I mean, there are countries where it's blood or soil, right? And there are countries where it's by blood, like my ancestral homeland, actually. But here, where we're in the United States, we're born here, we're citizens. And I think the play there is to see if the Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, somehow, 5 of them rule differently. I mean, but if you read the plain text of the 14th Amendment, I think that you can't rule by fiat. Someone introduced legislation to allow Trump to run for a third term, which again is also not allowed in the Constitution. Well, if they think that he can just rule by fiat and by executive order, why doesn't he issue an executive order?
Just making up things left and right. Well, while I've got you in the hot seat, Dan, I mean, along with the governor, Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul also voiced opposition to ending birthright citizenship. What's he been doing?
Yeah, he joined with the governors of Arizona, Oregon, and Washington in a lawsuit saying that its birthright citizenship order, revoking birthright citizenship, I guess, would be unconstitutional. And as Rick said, I think the judge in the one case that immediately went to federal court, I believe the exact words were blatantly unconstitutional.
Yeah, Illinois is one of 22 states challenging this executive order. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on how all of these lawsuits turn out.
Well, especially with the Supreme Court. And that is going to be kind of the big uncertainty here, even though the courts have ruled before on issues of birthright citizen, including John McCain.
Yeah. How are other Illinois politicians responding to threats against immigrants, Simone? I know Chuy Garcia had something to say.
He came out and said, I think spoke from a deeply personal place as somebody, who somebody of Mexican descent and who, is firmly rooted in this community, right? Sort of came out and just. I mean, it's tough for me because you have a lot of the same thing going on across these statements. It's lambasting Donald Trump and just the sort of, again, the blatant fear mongering of it all, right? That's all. That's kind of what's going on. And then on top of that, saying, well, we're going to do what we can to protect immigrants here, and we'll see what they can do.
Yeah, he said, quote, it's showing hate and vitriol and demonstrating that he will be a divider in chief. End quote.
Yeah.
Well, and the lack of specifics of what's going on, what's filling that vacuum are rumor and fear and concern.
Let's take a quick pause right here. That's Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune, Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago, and WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos. We'll be right back to discuss more big stories from the week. This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons, and you're tuned into the weekly news recap, where we take you behind the headlines of the week's top local stories. Now, before the break, we took a close look at what Donald Trump's warnings of an immigration crackdown could mean for Chicago. But there's a lot more news to get to.
A Chicago cop has been disciplined for exhibiting the symbol of an extremist group while on duty.
Power and profit. Michael Madigan and Michael McLean conspired to enhance and preserve Madigan's power and line Madigan's pockets.
I did not receive a pardon. I received full vindication.
President Trump pardoned or commuted the sentences of about 1,500 people that were charged in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Some people died as a result of that attack. Every American should be appalled.
Our panel today to help break down these stories: Simone, executive producer of CityCast Chicago, the daily podcast and newsletter; Rick Pearson, chief political reporter for the Chicago Tribune; and Dan Mihalopoulos, WBEZ investigative reporter. So another headline-grabbing development on Inauguration Day was, of course, the president pardoning the January 6th defendants, Dan. So who are some of the people in Illinois?
They're about 53. I think my friend John Seidel, the federal court reporter at the Sun-Times, has been keeping very, very close track of this massive historic investigation. I think it's the biggest investigation in the history of the Justice Department, which was just wiped absolutely clean for the most part. I mean, those convictions will still be there, and some of them had their sentences commuted instead of getting pardoned. But effectively,
what was the range of their sentences that folks had gotten?
Yeah, the range was pretty vast. I mean, some of them, I would guess 1,500 or so had been already convicted and sentenced by the time of Trump's blanket sort of wide-ranging pardon. But there were people that got years, as much as I think 20-something years in the cases of some of these Oath Keepers and others who were in these militia and far-right groups that were charged and convicted of seditious conspiracy and not just coming in and rioting. But a lot of them assaulted cops. We saw it all on video. So there was a vast range in terms of the kinds of behavior and the kinds of sentences, and all of it is just obliterated now.
All right, well, time to turn to the Michael Madigan trial, Rick. They finally got to closing arguments this week.
Indeed. We actually believe that the defense is actually going to be presenting its final closing starting today. 4 months of very interesting details.
Yeah, what were the main takeaways, you think?
Well, looking at the prosecution summing up its case, and I think, you heard the profit and power of Dave McKinney speaking there.
Yes,
but
in our clip.
That was one of the prosecution elements, as well as the Make Mike Madigan Money plan. And now that was yesterday. Now, and truly, this is an important part for the prosecution, because I felt that this was going to be the most difficult aspect of their case, of trying to prove a quid pro quo between actions and frankly, pocketing money. And what the prosecution is taking this elaborate case and trying to bring it full circle to point out that through enlisting allies, such as Alderman Danny Solis, who turned informant, a vital informant in this case, through him and his ability to shape zoning in his ward, that in turn would lead to profits for Mike Madigan's property tax appeals law firm. And so a lot of this case had obviously dealt with ComEd and favors that ComEd did, hiring people for no work jobs that were close to Mike Madigan. But where was the quid pro quo there? And the prosecution is arguing, well, those jobs are bribes, basically. Okay. Those are bribing Mike Madigan. But again, when people think of quid pro quo and bribes, they're thinking of the money aspect. Well, now by enlisting Solis and the zoning and the law firm, they're trying to bring this case into a full circle, that this is a vast criminal conspiracy. And I mean, I always thought the quid pro quo issue was going to be tough for the jury to understand, but I'm wondering now if maybe prosecutors are confident they may have cleared that hurdle. But as I said, defense arguments are just beginning this afternoon. Right. They're going to continue into next week.
We'll have to see how they poke holes in that. So we also had Attorney General Kwame Raoul weighing in on an issue.
Yes, Tim Mapes, who was Madigan's longtime chief of staff. He was executive director of the Democratic Party when Mike Madigan chaired the Democratic Party. He was the Illinois House clerk. He was convicted in 2023 of, despite receiving immunity from prosecution, of basically giving false testimony to a grand jury as well as obstruction of justice as part of the investigation into Madigan. He was, the Attorney General said that he should not get his state taxpayer pension as a result of that conviction. Indeed, he hasn't been getting it since early 2024 because of that conviction, but now it's up really to the state, I want to say, retirement board to make that ultimate decision. He still is eligible to take the money that he paid into his pension, but that money is dwarfed by what the state contribution.
And we're talking about $154,000 pension
is what it would be. It's kind of what happened with George Ryan.
When are we expecting jury deliberations to begin?
In the Madigan case, I would expect probably mid to late next week.
Okay. While jurors will soon be weighing in on how politics are done in Illinois, it's going to be business as usual for lawmakers in Springfield next week. Now, Simone, one issue the legislature might take up again soon is hemp regulation. Where are we with that?
In the moment, very much in limbo.
Nowhere
at the moment.
Up in smoke?
Yeah.
That's a
good
one.
That's a good one. Folks might remember seeing that during the short session earlier this month, lawmakers were set to take up a measure to regulate these Delta 8, Delta 10 products that they see in smoke shops and corner stores and things like that. And the idea, it was pushed by Pritzker and other advocates, and the idea was essentially it's as a safety measure. A lot of these products are... they are intoxicating. They look in some ways very similar to legalized cannabis, but also they are way more accessible than what you would find at a dispensary. And, they are largely sort of unregulated because of the way that those products are made, and because they're derived from hemp. And that bill stalled in the legislature largely in part because Mayor Brandon Johnson came out and said, well, we want Chicago to be able to pass our own regulations or taxation potentially. The House Speaker, Emanuel Chris Welch, didn't call for a vote on it, and it became kind of this big power struggle. The question remains, I think there are a lot of reasons that it could be worth, looking at this. Again, that kind of safety, product quality control thing. Is there equity between the legal cannabis industry and the hemp industry, especially, from the side of small business owners who are selling these products, and like how difficult it is to get into legalized cannabis, and then on top of that is who gets to benefit from any potential fees, taxes, et cetera, that could come as a result of regulation. So it's something
a lot of questions to be answered still then.
I'm certainly really curious to see if and how this comes up during the session in the spring.
Well, this week, the governor signed a bill that did pass, Simone. It was called the Dignity in Pay Act. What's that about?
So that is about phasing out the sub-minimum wage for folks with disabilities. Folks, people may hear sub-minimum wage and remember the tipped minimum wage. Similarly, it has been legal to pay people who have a disability a lower wage than the minimum wage. And this goes all the way back to a federal law from 1938 and has to do with sort of this idea that if you have a disability that prevents you from being as productive, at the minimum productivity, then employers can pay you less. This presents a whole square of issues, right, of people not being able to get paid, and they're getting paid.
Oh, my goodness, of course.
As little as 50 cents an hour.
50 cents an hour, or less than $100 a month.
Yeah.
For 40 hours a week.
For 40 hours a week. And so this new law would move to phase that in to get it on par with the minimum wage by 2029. It's interesting because there were opponents to this in Springfield. Family members of people who have disabilities who work some of these jobs who say, well, if you make them raise the wages, then these jobs are going to go away, and then we'll have no jobs, and then what do you do? But I think for most folks hearing this kind of on its face, I think a lot of people probably just don't even realize that this exists unless it affects them.
This was a thing, yeah. This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. We are breaking down the biggest stories of the week with Simone, Alicea of CityCast Chicago, WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos, and Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune. So an update on Chicago teacher contract negotiations is next. CPS, so Chicago Public Schools, and its teachers union, they took the step of bringing in an arbitrator. What does that signal then for how the negotiations are going between those groups?
Not amazing.
All right. Another great update by Simone Alicea.
Yeah, I feel like you could just clip that and just put me in on every
right.
one. So what this is when Rahm Emanuel was mayor, he created this process whereby, before the teachers union can strike, and that there is sort of an intractable that the negotiation is considered like intractable, you have to bring in a fact finder arbitrator, someone who's going to come in and kind of review all the proposals and, make some recommendations and make some findings.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers union has come out and said that they think this process is sort of inherently biased toward the city, saying that, the arbitrator is limited by certain things. So, for example, when examining pay structure, pay raises, they're supposed to compare to the 4 highest paid school districts in the country, and CTU pointing out that some of those districts are non-union districts, for example,
mm-hmm.
and are those comparisons fair? The arbitrator is supposed to is supposed to make these considerations with the idea of the money that is sort of already available to the district rather than new lines of credit, new revenue coming in. The teachers union says that is sort of like, that's sort of like deciding whether or not you can pay rent based on what you currently have in your bank account. But, I do think that the revenue question is a key one for CPS, right?
What does all this mean then for the possibility of a strike?
It means that there is one. There is a possibility, right? And I think
could be as early as March.
Exactly. It's who knows yet with strikes and negotiations. You never, it's always never say never, and it's always never say for sure until it happens.
All right. In other school news, federal authorities are investigating a local charter school. What's going on there, Dan?
Right. We're talking about Urban Prep Academies, which has 2 schools on the south side of Chicago. They were, for many years, highly acclaimed for helping young black students, black men, to get through school there. And as it turned out, they've had trouble for a few years with CPS and also with the Inspector General at CPS. Their CEO, Tim King, left in 2022 under pressure from CPS, which authorizes and regulates these schools and also funds them for the most part with our taxpayer dollars. But what was not known until this week was that the feds are also on the case. The feds have been investigating. They're still investigating, according to my sources. And we got hold of the subpoenas that Urban Prep got from the U.S. Attorney here in the Northern District in Illinois, asking for things such as reimbursement payments to Tim King. So obviously they're looking into how they were spending that money, and with regard to their founder and longtime CEO, he denies wrongdoing. The schools say that they're cooperating with any investigation and deny wrongdoing. But this is just another of these issues that they're facing as they're continuing to fight with CPS to stay open. And that's the latest from there. We had to go to court. I should give a shout out to our Freedom of Information Act attorneys, Matt Topic and Josh Lovey. They didn't want to give us the subpoenas, Urban Prep. They thought they didn't have to. I think we all know that the law in Illinois is that they have to.
Yeah.
So we went to court, and before we had a ruling from the court, they did give us the documents, and we did the story.
Yeah. Well, sticking with you, Dan, I want to turn to Chicago police for a moment. An officer was disciplined for wearing an extremist symbol to a protest back in March of 2020. What?
So, it was the summer of 2020, right after, the George Floyd protests and everything that went on with that. Just a few days after that, at a racial justice event, this officer, Kyle Mangari, was patrolling wearing a mask with the symbol of a 3%ers, who are like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, one of these right-wing groups that says, well, if we think that the government is being tyrannical and unconstitutional, we can take matters into our own hands. So he claimed that he didn't know. They thought it was a patriotic item, but it took it took only 5 years. But Chicago police gave him the crushing penalty of a reprimand, which I think is the lightest possible punishment he could have gotten.
The IG expressed concerns over how he was disciplined, right?
Yeah, Inspector General Deborah Witzberg has...
What did she say?
Well, she's long said that the CPD goes very easy on members who have links to the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and other extremist groups. And the first investigation actually said, no harm, no foul. They closed it very quickly. A couple years ago, she said, hey, you should reinvestigate it. The police reinvestigated it. And, like I said, finally they said that this week, Witzberg revealed actually that they had agreed to give him a reprimand for sporting a mask that had the Three Percenter symbol at a racial justice
reprimand.
Nobody wants a reprimand.
Nobody wants a reprimand. Let's take a quick pause. That is WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos, Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune, and Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago. We will be right back to discuss more big stories. Believe it or not, there are more. And we are back now with more Reset. I'm your host, Sasha-Ann Simons. We're in the home stretch of our weekly news recap, giving you a closer look at the top stories across Chicago and Illinois. Now, before the break, we heard about the closing arguments in former Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan's corruption trial. But we still got some more news to cover with Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago, Rick Pearson of the Chicago Tribune, and WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos. All right, financial pressures are impacting Planned Parenthood in Illinois, Simone. Can you give us a quick update there?
Yeah, Planned Parenthood in Illinois is closing 4 clinics, including one in the Englewood neighborhood.
4 of them.
Wow. Yes. And the other ones in Ottawa, Decatur, and Bloomington. And it's interesting because I feel like to get this announcement the week of inauguration, after Trump has, made getting rid of abortion such a key part of his platform for years and years and years, you're thinking, oh no, what's going on? Planned Parenthood Illinois is citing financial pressures, fewer reimbursements or lower reimbursements for patients, and just making it very difficult to care for patients. None of these clinics provided procedural abortion care services, but they did provide medication abortion.
Yeah, and they were increasingly getting patients from states where abortion is now illegal.
Huge influx of because Illinois is surrounded by states where abortions are illegal or severely limited.
Right.
And so in the past 4 years during the last administration, they had opened clinics, especially following the Dobbs decision. And what they've said is that they will try to increase services at some of their other clinics, particularly in these other parts of the state, to try to get the runoff from the clinics that are closing. But yeah, I think very, very disappointing news.
Timing is tough on that one
for folks who are looking for care.
Mm-hmm. All right, football fans, we didn't forget about you. I'm going to toss this one over to you, Rick. The Bears have a new coach.
Ben Johnson.
Yeah, who is he?
Ben Johnson. This could be the guy.
Okay. All right. You seem hopeful.
Well, I'm hopeful, particularly because in his news conference, he and George McCaskey talked about this. He kept saying, I really want this job. And the thing is, I think he's got the chops for it. Now, he's been offensive coordinator at the Detroit Lions since 2022.
Okay.
So let's take a look at the Lions' record. In each of the last 3 seasons, the Lions have had a top 4 offense, okay? They've had 3 of their history's 4 highest scoring seasons while Ben Johnson's been offensive coordinator.
That is also a positive, for
they
sure.
They set a 95-year franchise record of points scored in 2024 with 564 points. The Bears, by the way, had 310. Okay. Now, look who directs that offense under Ben Johnson is Jared Goff. And what the Bears have been looking for is the magic elixir of a coach and a quarterback that can mesh and play. So take a look at Jared Goff for a minute. So he played 5 seasons with the Rams before he went to Detroit in 2020, and he had a couple of good years, but mainly mediocre ones. Now, under Johnson, Goff passing ratings, 99.3, 97.9, and this past season, 111.8, 72% completion rate, 4,629 yards, and 37 touchdowns.
So the Ben Johnson-Caleb combo should work.
Yes. So now compare that to Caleb in his first season. 87.8 passer rating, 62.5% completion rate, not bad first year, but 3,541 yards passing and 20 touchdowns. I mean, we see the potential with Caleb on and off, but it's been such an erratic, and of course through multiple coaches, multiple schemes, an offensive line that still is going to have to get some work done.
Well, hopefully here comes the consistency that he needs.
And Ben Johnson's 38 years old, so it's not like they could have had all of these older coaches that were out there and available. But here's a guy, and he wants to play in the NFC North, calls it the toughest division, and he wants to beat the Packers. He wants to beat his old team, the Lions, and he wants to do it as coach of the Chicago Bears.
All right. Well, you've got me excited.
Well, we need to be excited. We
Yeah?
need to be excited about it.
Oh, for
because
sure.
This has been so dang depressing. And
what a season
I've
it's
got
been.
relatives in Minnesota, and they're sending me
you're getting the memes and
bad texts and things. And
I'm
it's
so
just,
sorry.
I'm tired of it.
Are you as optimistic, Dan?
No, of course not. But I'm blown away by I'm blown away by Rick's knowledge. I feel like we're on the score here, or like the ghost of Tim Weigel. Catman's got nothing on Rick.
Yes,
Catman's got nothing.
I want to come
Rick.
prepared and simple, though.
You did it.
But the guy does have some bona fides.
Yeah. Well, we've got some drama in the arts, and Simone, I need you to tell us about it. The city council is asking that a racist puppet be removed from the Chicago Cultural Center. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so a group of alders, a majority, 27, have demanded that a work of art that is on display at the Chicago Cultural Center be removed. They are calling it anti-Semitic. The display in question is a couple of very large puppets, kind of in a political cartoonish style, and one is of Uncle Sam. One is of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and both with blood on their faces, and it's the display is called U.S.-Israel War Machine. And these alders, led by City Council's lone Jewish member, Alderwoman Deborah Silverstein, are saying they're calling it anti-Semitic. Now, I think there are a lot of questions as to
and they called it racist. By the way, when I said racist puppet, I want to make sure that it's clear. I had air quotes around that word.
And it's interesting because in the correspondence with the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, I think there are a lot of questions as to what is the purpose of displaying political art in a public space, and when is it an impingement? If you're removing it, when is that an impingement on the First Amendment, on freedom of speech? Again, Silverstein and her colleagues in the council, they say this should be elevated to hate speech, but I do think it is I certainly think it's a matter of debate in this case.
Switching gears, nearly 3,000 chickens at a farm in southwest suburban Madison have died of bird flu. What do we know, Simone?
Yeah, this is so sad.
How disturbing.
I think we've been hearing a lot about bird flu across the country, and I think in particular it has been tied to the very high price of eggs. Well,
yeah, I mean, we talked about it last Friday. 2 animals at the Lincoln Park Zoo died from it
and
as well.
That's the other thing, right? Affecting animals and affecting waterfowl in across the state as well. But this is the first time that there has been a reported case of sort of an outbreak at a farm in Illinois, and it's at Cockadoodle-Doo in Matson, Illinois, and they said they went from 3,000 hens to now none are left, and it's a huge blow to the business, right, of the farm there, and I think it probably puts I imagine it puts others on edge for their own flocks as well.
Yeah, all 3,000 birds died. It's believed that the culprit was infected wild birds getting into the chicken feed. And so Cockadoodle Farm is prohibited from raising any chickens for the next 150 days, so until June.
So there's just roosters there now.
One,
No
Yep.
hens left.
one imagines, no hens.
Sorry.
Dan.
They'll be alone for a while.
Where do the eggs come from?
Roosters can't do it alone.
Yeah.
The James Beard semifinalists were announced on Wednesday, and the biggest ever Chicago Restaurant Week kicks off today. So, Simone, are there restaurants participating that you're like excited about this time around?
On my radar, okay, 470 restaurants. It is so hard to pick for Restaurant Week. And, you know, we've put together a couple different lists at CityCast Chicago. We talked to someone about the best deals. So if the deal is your thing, you should listen to that. We just looked at some of our favorites. One that I'm looking at, just because it is a newer spot near my neighborhood. It's in Andersonville, Tala House. And I think Restaurant Week is such a good opportunity to try new spots.
Yeah, what kind of food is that?
Tala House is, as I recall, I think it's a New American. Yes, American contemporary. But you know, in Andersonville, you know, there's a lot of great spots. Like, I am constantly in Andersonville eating all the food, and somehow this totally missed me, this opening. And so that is one I want to try. And they have brunch and 2 different dinner specials as well. So
Nice.
for Restaurant Week, the brunch lunch specials are $30, and then the dinner goes from, there's a $45 option, or some restaurants have a $60 option for prefix menus.
Oh, good tip. Thank you for sharing. I mean, did either of you, Dan and Rick, did you snag some
You're asking the
Restaurant
wrong
Week
guy.
reservations?
I won't speak for Rick. I'm a beef burgers and dogs kind of Chicago.
But
What about you,
Simone's
Rick?
right. Well, I have not, but I will tell you, truly, this is the time to get outside your comfort zone.
Yes.
And the places that you always go to.
Yeah.
And snag some of these deals.
I agree.
And it is, obviously, it's great promotion for a restaurant community that is second to none in the United States.
Yeah.
So it's well worth going after.
Chicago Restaurant Week, January 24th, so it's today, to February 9th. Any big surprises, Simone, by the way, among those semifinalists for the James Beard?
You know which one I want to call out is the chef behind Feld, which is that restaurant in Ukrainian Village. The chef is Jacob Potashnik, earned a nomination in the category of Emerging Chef. The reason I want to call this out is because I remember when Feld opened in the summer, and it was panned on social media. People were posting, because, you know, it's just one of these big, you know, multiple course tasting menus, and, you know, you got these pictures of these little slices of cheese and these little crackers, and people were like, I'm paying how much for what? But we just spoke with Tribune food critic Louisa Chu, who just went in the past couple months, and said that it was one of her favorite dining experiences ever. She was like, the hype was totally wrong. It was some bad pictures on social media. So I am really, the buzz is starting to build back up for me for Feld. And so I thought it was interesting that they earned this nod from the James Beard Awards.
So it's more than just one piece of cheese?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Reports say.
Okay.
Reports indicate. Well, we'll leave it there. My thanks to Chicago Tribune's Rick Pearson, Simone Alicea of CityCast Chicago, and WBEZ's Dan Mihalopoulos. Have a great weekend.
You too.
You too.
Thanks.